Let me begin with an interaction that I had some months ago. I was in a restaurant with a few friends, and amongst the people around, I sat next to a couple, um, and during the conversation, he indicated that they had recently um, announced their engagement. Of course, um, good news. And as the conversation and interaction as we had dinner, um, I asked the question. Generally, uh, I can be quite curious, inquisitive. Some might say nosy, but I asked the question to the guy. Why are you getting married? No, before this, I asked the question, how did you propose? And he described what happened, the stage, the environment, the scene, time of the day, how he did it. Beautiful. And then I asked the question, why are you getting married? And he couldn't answer the question. I asked his wife to be, why are you getting married? Why get married? And she couldn't answer the question. So I wasn't surprised. Over the many last few years, in interacting with various people, I've made an observation, which is that most people get married as a result of an expectation set for them by loved ones, family, associations. In any case, I was puzzled. I was puzzled for a number of reasons. The first reason is, for most of us, one of the most important decisions that we make, should we choose to, is getting married, choosing a life partner. For most people, that comes next to perhaps buying our first home, which is perhaps if you buy a home with the mortgage, you make a commitment for 30 years, and therefore that decision is taken very carefully, intelligently, prudently. But when it comes to choosing a life partner, I have found that most people do not understand the purpose of marriage. They don't know why they get married. And the spouse is none the wiser. Now, this is not a critique against marriage as an institution, but I will say this. The person in question was in his early 30s. The woman in question was in her early 30s. I'm speaking now to my undergraduate students. Let me make that clear. And I'll state the outcome of the punchline first before I explain. If you're a man, a modern man, dating in the modern world, I don't believe, and it is my recommendation, first of all, I don't see and I don't believe that there is any benefit to a man being married today. And if you're between 18 and 35, marriage should be the last thing on your mind. As a matter of fact, I think for men, I'm speaking to men, you should not be in a committed relationship, a mono relationship, an exclusive relationship. um, or anything resembling a married engagement between 18 and 35. That period of your life is the most important phase that you have to dream, to pursue that dream, to understand your purpose, to try and achieve your purpose or some element of your purpose, to fail, to succeed, to fail again, to succeed, and everything about the requirements of marriage or a committed relationship serves as an obstacle to you becoming yourself. And so my recommendation is that if you're between 18 and 35, marriage should be something that you set aside. And here's the reason. Most men, say between 18 and 22, you have perhaps just graduated, you got to university, graduated from university, you start working at 22. You're still too young, way too young, to be focused on a family. Now let me explain something perhaps which might connect the dots. If you go back to the 18th century, the average life expectancy for a man and a woman, was somewhere in the region of 36 years old. The average age at which a man and a woman got married was somewhere around 21, 22 years old. So in principle, you made a decision, you chose someone. The terms were different back then, but in principle, you had at most 20 years to live with one person, to be committed to one person for the rest of your life. Let's fast forward to the 19th century. The life expectancy increased thanks to biology and the various studies we did, the development of antibiotics, etc. But the life expectancy increased to about 42, 43 years. In the 19th century, the average age of people who got married, men and women, was still in the early 20s. Again, you still had 20 plus years to live with someone, to be committed to someone. Now recognize that in the 18th century and the 19th century, similar to what we have today, 20 years old, 22, 23, 24, 25, is way too young for a man in terms of our maturity. But back then, it was acceptable for the simple reason you had to procreate. Society was different back then. You needed more hands on the farm because to have kids was an asset, because you needed people in the farms. Whereas today is very different. Different landscape. In any case, we fast forward to the 21st century. The life expectancy for the average man in the West, now I know this is slightly different and it varies across continents, but in the West, let me use the United Kingdom as a reference, the life expectancy is approaching 80 years. So technically, for those who are getting married at 25 or 22 and are still keeping that tradition from old times, in principle, you still have 2/3 or 66% of your life ahead of you. There's a slight difference. The landscape has changed. The expectations on a man has changed. The gender roles have evolved. In addition to that, there are very few fathers that are in the homes raising men. Most men have been raised without fathers. And so most boys are not mature. At 22, you still have all that energy and testosterone and excitement, and a lot of that is mistaken for wisdom. Um, and it is my experience that most boys and most men do not mature or do not begin to mature until they reach their 30s. So 30 should be perhaps, uh, I guess, a milestone from when you start to consider getting married with the intention, and this is my personal recommendation, with the intention of getting married no sooner than 35. You can entertain the idea at 30. You don't make the decision until 35. And this is for one of many reasons. A man is judged by his ability to provide, primarily his economic value. Between 20 and 30, you're still developing your gifts, your skills. You're still learning, and therefore your ability to provide in the sexual marketplace is usually at its minimum the younger you are. And in many ways, you haven't come into your manhood. You haven't come to understand yourself, which means that in many scenarios, some decisions that ought not to have been made are often made. So my recommendation is, if you choose to, again, now I'm going to move to what I call my postgraduate students, 35 and above. For those who choose to marry or get married, you should be considering getting married from 35 and above. Now, I'm going to deal with the conditions for such a decision in a different session, but let me stick to the UG class. And I would say between 18 and 35, and this is a personal position, about 95% of all of your time should be focused on you. You shouldn't be distracted by women. Between 18 and 35, 95% of your time should be focused, say between 18 and 22, education, becoming your best self, learning as much as you can, studying, reading, personal development. From 22, which is when you usually get into the work environment, you have usually 7 years to acquire your 10,000 hours of practice. Constant and never-ending improvement. Malcolm Gladwell came out with the concept of the 10,000 hour rule, which simply says, in order for you to become a master in any domain, in order for you to achieve a level of self-mastery, you need to do a task for at least 10,000 hours to achieve self-mastery. But there's a slight, perhaps, modification that I like to make to that statement, which is done consistently without interruption, done consistently with never-ending growth and improvement, done consistently through the process of first being an apprentice, becoming a student yourself, and then becoming what you might call someone who applies what they've learned. So in many ways, you could do something for 10,000 hours and be average. And someone who does it for less can be skilled. But for most people, we have periods of a break in between. We work for a year, we travel, we go on holidays, we get ill, life happens. And so you have to apply what I call a windage factor in your calculations. 10,000 hours is what you're aspiring to, but you should put in a 20% margin of safety. And we'll call that 12,000 hours. Now, there are 2,000 working hours in a year, 50 working weeks. I know it will vary depending on where you live in the West, but let's say 50 working weeks, 40 working hours every week. That's 2,000 working hours, which simply means if you divide 12,000 by 2,000, you get 6 years. If you begin working at 22, that would simply mean that at 28, you're starting to come into your mastery. You're starting to come into your, what I will call self-actualization. You're becoming your best self in one area of life. And in this case, I'm talking about developing your skills, developing your earning ability, developing your talents, your gifts, becoming so good at one thing that people are willing to compensate you for that gift. That's 28 years old. But money and resources is only one aspect of what makes a complete life. You still need other things, like pillars. The way you build a house, you start with the foundation, but the foundation is built in different ways. If you're building a very high-rise building, then you have to go deeper in order to go higher up. If you're building in a relatively two-story building, then you can have shallow foundations. So depending on the life you want, you might decide you want your life to be as tall as possible. In other words, pushing yourself to see what you could become without limiting yourself to a particular height. And that would mean you'd have to go further down into the soil. That will require more time. That's the main reason I make reference to delaying any major decision you have to make, especially marriage, until 35. Because at 28, you've just come into your place based on your area of expertise. But like a wheel of a car, you have different areas. It's not just one area. You have spirituality, you have emotions, the emotional aspect to your life, you have your physical health, you certainly have work, you have finances, you have your mind and your well-being. All of these areas require time. So at 28, you're a master at work. You need a few more years in order for you to have gained enough worldly wisdom to be able to, stand guard and protect the garden you've created. Because there are snakes out there and they come in different shapes and colors and sizes, and they come in with different faces. It's not unusual to find people who are very, very good intellectually to be very naive in worldly matters, naive in relationships, and so they're taken advantage of by people out there. So my recommendation is, if you're between 18 and 35, 95% of your time should be spent on you, on yourself, on becoming your best version of yourself, on trying to establish how far you can push yourself to the edge of your potential and allow whatever comes forth to come. The biggest mistake that I have seen and observed is most men make the decision of marriage, fatherhood, too early, without direction, without a support system from a family, without the financial resources, without the wisdom needed to lead a family, to support a wife, to navigate the future. And so my intention is to say to the undergraduate students, 5% of your time should only be dedicated to women. And what this simply means is you do not have time for intimate long-term commitment. You do not have time to be spending on trivial issues that come with relationships. Now, can I just say that almost everything that has been sold to you about marriage is some idyllic, utopian fantasy or fairy tale. Marriage is work. Fatherhood is work. Being a leader is work. Asking a woman for her hand in marriage is work. And that work has to be done every single day. The foundations that are needed to keep that institution that you create, whether as a father, whether as a husband, whether as a partner, need to be reinforced and built very early. So 5% of your time on women. And what that simply means, and forgive me for using this word, what that simply means is that between the age of 18 and 35, you will need booty calls. And that's what I call them. And that's what they should be. 95% of your time is on your purpose. On trying, failing, becoming your best self so that you have the resources, you have the wisdom, you have the experience. More importantly, so that you've tried out everything, so that when the time comes to make a decision about fatherhood or family, you're not distracted. You're not looking back thinking perhaps the grass is greener on the other side. So keep that in mind. Let me conclude with the following. There is no, in today's modern society, there is no benefit to a man to get married. None. Now, if you think I am wrong, I'd love to hear from you. The benefit to marriage comes to children and the wife, because she has an option policy if the marriage fails. And I agree 100% that if you intend to have children, the institution of a marriage and a loving family is not just necessary, I think it's fundamental. Marriage is beneficial to women, is beneficial to kids and children, but there is no benefit to marriage. And I'll leave you with perhaps a short reason for that statement, with the intention being that perhaps I can expand on that some other time. But the reason is simply because there is nothing that a man can get from marriage today that he cannot get outside of marriage. But there's a downside. As a matter of fact, I believe in today's modern society, it's all downsides for men. There is no benefit, none. Again, if the man wants to have children, that is an exception. If he wants to have children, that is an exception. If he intends to give his wife to be his last name, in other words, asking for that honor, maybe that's an exception. But if you notice, those two exceptions benefit the woman and the children, not the man. So let me conclude by saying between 18 and 35, you shouldn't be thinking about marriage. You shouldn't be thinking about relationships. You shouldn't be thinking about being in a mono relationship or in a long-term relationship. You shouldn't be cohabiting. You shouldn't be living with a woman. There should only be one thing in your mind and on your mind every day. Work. Learn as much as you can. Develop yourself to be the best you can be. Create value for other people through service. And the more people you serve, the more your compensation increases. So that at 35, you have enough resources, you have enough wisdom, you have enough discernment, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and even more importantly, you've had enough experiences, even sexually, for you to make a decision at 35 that the institution of marriage, your wife, or the kids to come are more important than any temporary experience that comes from the life you've lived before. Now, with that, let me stop and I'll pick it up at the next session.